Hello, can you hear me? Okay. I'm Nancy Mannering. I'm the leader of the sustainability theme here at Ohio University and also political science faculty. And it's so wonderful to look out and see all of you. And we have had the most wonderful day with Francis and Anna, and very excited about this opportunity. So my dean, Bob Frank, is going to do the official introduction. What I want to do is, if you'll bear with me, because it's kind of a long list, I want to thank all of our co-sponsors. And that's important for obvious reasons, because this wouldn't be happening if we didn't have all that support. But I think the length of the list, it's reasonable, but the length, it tells us a lot about the appeal of the kind of work that Francis and Anna do. So without further ado, let me thank the College of Arts and Sciences and the departments of economics, geography, geology, history, political science, and sociology, environmental studies in the Voinovich School of Leadership and Public Affairs, the College of Health Sciences and Professions, the Food Studies, Ohio Sense of Place, and Making and Breaking the Law themes, the Office of Sustainability, and last but not least, the student group Eco-Reps, who helped provide this space for us. So at this time, I'd like to introduce my dean, Robert Frank.
Wow. I love doing introductions like this when it's a group like this that has attracted people from so many different segments of the community and the university. Nancy, I think that might be a record for sponsorships of an event, and rightly so, because we have people here with us tonight who have a reputation that precedes them. So I was with Frankie and Anna a little earlier today and noticed there was a person in the crowd who had this very old paperback that was all crinkled up and treasured clearly. Yeah, there. So how many people have something like that? And yeah, see. So it just must be incredible to have that experience, Frankie, for that particular book. But anyway, so well known to some of you there, and better known here in a minute. So I just want to do a little bit of a biography here. I'll say Frankie, okay? Lappé is author and co-author of 18 books, including 3 million copy Diet for a Small Planet. Frankie was named by Gourmet magazine as one of 25 people, including Thomas Jefferson, Upton St. Clair, and Julia Child, whose work had changed the way America eats. Her most recent work is World Hunger, 10 Myths, which she and co-author Joseph Collins wrote and was published in October. She holds 18 honorary degrees and is co-founder of 3 organizations, including Oakland-based think tank Food First, and more recently, Small Planet Institute, which she leads with her daughter, Anna. And Frances and her daughter have also co-founded Small Planet Fund, which channels resources to democratic social movements worldwide. So that's half of the team. The other half is Anna, who's also a national best-selling author and has an international reputation as an expert on food systems. She's a co-founder of Small Planet Institute and Small Planet Fund with her mother, Frankie, and is currently the director of Real Food Media, a collaborative initiative to inspire, educate, and grow the movement of sustainable food and farming. She regularly consults with foundations and philanthropists fostering food system change, and is the advisor to the Plantaray Foundation Food Program. And it says on this piece of paper she lives in San Francisco Bay, which is another reason to be envious of, and I was just saying we have a direct flight to Oakland now, in case you didn't know that, out of Columbus. The title of their presentation is A Sustainable Food Movement Rising. So I give you the Lappés.
I'll go that way. Thank you. Oh, Mom, I think you're pushing the clicker. So you got a little preview of what's in store. So good evening, good evening. How's everyone doing tonight? Great, great. So it is a real thrill for us to be here. My mother and I have been collaborating for 15 years now, but this is really one of the first chances we've had in a long time to be together, with her doing something other than being a grandmother to my 2 daughters. So it's really, really fun to be here. And I feel like, can everybody hear me? I know we're getting a little feedback. Hopefully it will stabilize. So I feel like we will have done our job this evening if you all leave here with some new ideas about how to think about the world, how to think about food, how to think about and frame hunger in your minds. If you also leave with a greater sense of an urgency around the food crisis, if you came in here with that sense of urgency, we might stoke that fire a little bit. If you didn't come in here with a sense of urgency, we hopefully might start that fire in you. And we hope that you leave with a greater sense of possibility. And we certainly have been so inspired by everything we've seen just in the 24 hours since we've been here that's happening right here in this community. So we hope you leave here with either a greater sense of you are doing amazing things, or that you want to jump in and join something that's happening here in this community. And so we hope that that's some of what you get, and we're going to go back and forth, and so my mom's going to take it from here.
Well, I have to say, this community, Athens, you have set the standard. I don't know if I can stand going to another university town and not hearing these glorious stories of what you're all accomplishing. It's amazing. I had the crazy idea that I would be coming to share with you what I had to say, and actually, all I've been doing is learning and writing notes. So it's fabulous. Congratulations, and thank you so much again, Dr. May, and Dean Frank, for all of your work. Nancy, hats off to you. You are fabulous, fabulous host. So I've got to start though way back. I saw those brown, yellowed, crispy page Diet for a Small Planet. So I'm going to take you back a second, because I want you to know where I started. I started with that square one question. Have we really hit the Earth's limits to feed us? Is that why there's so much hunger in the world? So there I am, right? I'm trying to figure out, is it really true? Is it really true? And then I headed to the library to find out from that log, sort of. And so I kept asking that question. Why hunger? Why hunger? But over these now many decades, it's been 45 years since Diet for a Small Planet came out, I keep asking the next question. I think that's a good thing to do. Finally, my question grew by the 1990s to, can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. To, how can it be that we, the brightest species, are in this situation where we together are creating a world that not one of us as individuals would choose? Think about it. Who do you know who got up this morning and said, yes, I want to make sure that another person is food deprived today, another child dies of hunger? No, we don't know anybody like that. So together, we're creating a world that actually, as individuals, we abhor. So I started trying to figure this out. What is different about us? We're the brightest species. How could this be? And I've been taught by many great teachers over time that maybe, my proposition to us tonight, maybe there's only one thing that can explain it. That we humans are creatures of the mind. We uniquely see the world not as it is, but as we are, through culturally determined filters that we can't see outside of. This was stated so beautifully by Aldous Huxley, who said, all that we are and will and be depends in the last analysis on what we believe the nature of things to be. The nature of things to be. We can't see what doesn't fit inside of that belief system. So I want to give you a very homey example of what I'm talking about. A few Thanksgivings ago, I got up in the morning very excited to make my favorite root vegetable dish. 35 people coming in the afternoon, and I wanted to get right on it. So I went to the cupboard where I knew my Dutch oven lived, and it wasn't there, and I was so annoyed. And I looked in every cupboard. I went to the basement. I couldn't find it anywhere. And very annoyed, I gave up and started chopping vegetables. About 15 minutes later, I turned around, And there it was. Only it had a plant in it. Right? So I was looking for a Dutch oven, not a planter. Now, I want to tell you that I started laughing because it is big and it is red. And I still didn't recognize it because I was looking for something else. And so what I'm suggesting is that we human beings, if we really want to understand why we're in this predicament, and we're going to be identifying many pieces of it today, why we're here, it's my big claim that we are locked inside a mental map, a set of cultural filters that is not just misaligned with nature and our nature, but malaligned, perversely aligned, in opposition to what brings out the best in our relationship to nature and with each other. So that's a pretty big claim. But it started when I was back there on that log and when I was in my 20s, and we were being told that we were running out of everything. And so we were certainly running out of food. You know, we heard about the population bomb. We were overrunning the Earth's planet, over our capacity to feed us. And so I came to see that actually this premise of scarcity had several parts to it. I came to call it the scarcity mind. It is the idea that there's not enough of anything, but it has 3 S's that define it. It is, well, that's what I just finished saying, and then to the 3 pieces of the scarcity mind. It is this notion that we are fundamentally separate from one another, that things are really static, whether it's human nature or the capitalist system, it is as it is, nothing we can do much, and that scarcity characterizes everything. I came to see this scarcity mind as not just that there's not enough food, there's not enough energies, there's not enough parking places on campus, you know. It's not just those things, but it's also the notion of scarcity of goodness in us. So I kind of summed it up as scarcity of goods and goodness. And that sense then of problem really kept us in a major, major dilemma. And we hear it all the time. One of my favorite examples, a few years ago, Nina Fedorov, who was the science advisor to George Bush, said that if we actually moved toward organic agriculture, that basically half the world would starve. I mean, those weren't her exact words, but that was the idea. It was a fear message. It was there's not enough, and certainly we're trapped into the current model of agriculture, or we're doomed to starve. So, and I also think, unfortunately, that even progressives, as I consider myself, a lot of us tend to also feed the scarcity model inadvertently, the fear model, by suggesting, oh, there's not enough, we've got to cut back, we're overdoing, we've got to cut back. And we know, psychologists tell us that actually fear like this brings out the worst in us, our more material selves, our more self-interested selves. And it starts then what is the ultimate problem that I perceive today, that it begins what I call the spiral of powerlessness. Because if we don't believe in ourselves, if we don't believe that we have the capacity, if we see ourselves fundamentally as selfish little shoppers, then we can't believe that we can trust our neighbors, certainly if we can't trust ourselves to come together in common problem solving, also called democracy. And we start to look for some automatic, infallible law that we can turn over our fate to, that will resolve outcomes, and we flawed individuals don't have to do it because we're too selfish and materialistic. And so Ronald Reagan told us what it is. It is the magic of the marketplace. And then we learned, of course, it's not any kind of marketplace. It's one that we've now come to accept, driven by one rule, that which brings highest return to existing wealth. So wealth returns to wealth, until we end up with so much concentrated wealth that it infuses and begins to control our political system. And we now see evidence of that in every dimension of life, certainly in the food industry, as we'll see. And so then what happens? Inequities grow, as we now know. 20 Americans control as much wealth as the bottom half of the population. We end up with such concentration that people actually experience scarcity, food insecurity in the wealthiest country in the world. And then we say, see, I told you so, I told you so. Look at all the greed and look at all the scarcity. So the sense of lack of goods and lack of goodness is intensified, and the spiral goes even ever faster. And so what happens then is that we end up in this world, the spiral of powerlessness on a global scale ends up actually, these numbers have just been lowered. This 85 people controlling as much wealth as the bottom half of the world's people. This is now even worse today. The new numbers are out. So I have to update that slide. The point is, though, that these conditions, this spiral of powerlessness then ends up creating a world that we now know, whether we're looking at our long social evolution or whether we're looking at experiments done on us, like the prison experiment. How many of you have heard of the Stanford prison experiment? A lot of you have, where we were the guinea pigs, and it turns out that even people have tested normal within a few days. When the guards versus the prisoners, people started treating each other brutally. So in the wrong conditions, we know not just a few crazy people, but most of us will behave brutally in the wrong conditions. And so I started asking myself, okay, what are the conditions that have shown throughout history and these lab experiments to bring out the worst in us? And I'm claiming tonight that there are three conditions that have shown over eons of time to bring out the worst in our species. They are concentrated power, the lack of transparency or secrecy. You know, on Wall Street, before the meltdown, do you know what the slogan was among those traders who knew that these derivatives that they were selling were highly risky? They knew, but they said, IBG, YBG, I'll be gone, you'll be gone. In other words, they knew they'd be out of there, right? So we don't do well when there's no transparency, and we don't do well when we are trapped in a culture of blame, as we are today, most extremely in this election embodied in the Trump candidacy, of blaming the other. Oh, it's not me, it's not me, it's them, it's them, it's them. So we have created the very conditions that have shown to bring out the very worst in us. And the consequences of this are absolutely vast. And we're going to start then with talking about some of the consequences of this worldview, the scarcity mind that ends up creating the conditions that have been shown to bring out the very worst in us. And then there's a lot of good news to soon.
Here, I'll take that. So you're forewarned. This might be the sense of urgency moment. We talk about what's the impact of everything you just heard about. And I have to say, I don't know how many times I've seen that spiral of powerlessness, and every time I'm just struck again by its profundity, and I kind of have to sit with it every time and each of those steps along the way. And anyway, I love hearing my mom present that. So what's the impact, and how does this really touch down in food? And what could be more vital to life than food? To tell you some of this impact, I want to start with a bit of a story about really kind of how I got involved with this work. I mean, obviously, I was the test subject of all those recipes that you all have maybe tried on your children, so that was certainly part of it. But really, my first really getting involved with these issues as an adult was when my mother and I went on the journey to write Hope's Edge, the book, my first book, and her 15th or something. So we went on the journey to write Hope's Edge and to look at where in the world were people addressing that cycle of powerlessness and really rooting out hunger. And one of the places that we went was India. And one of our reasons for going there was to meet with farmers' networks that were really revitalizing indigenous foods and embracing organic techniques. And as part of that visit, we are traveling up into the foothills of the Himalayas, and if you can just imagine a dirt road on the side of a hill, going to visit a village that had never met Westerners before, had never met anybody from the United States. And we're driving along, and I look out the dusty car window, and I see a grove of eucalyptus trees that were all painted at eye level with the Pepsi logo. And we got to that village, and we heard from villagers that in certain parts of India, and including where we were visiting, it had become easier for villagers to get access to Pepsi. In some villages it was Coke, but in this case it was Pepsi. Easier for them to access Pepsi than it was for them to get potable drinking water. And I had this moment as somebody who was from the country that is home to the headquarters of this now global corporation, and I thought to myself, what better sign is there than this moment to remind me of the global reach and global impact of companies that are housed and homed here in my home in the United States. And therefore, what responsibility, what great responsibility we all have, as well as what great possibility we all have in terms of shaping the practices of those corporations. So I had that moment with the eucalyptus grove and the Pepsi logos, and then a couple days later, we were in a totally different area in India, in a place called the Punjab. It was a region that was home to Sikh farmers, and we had this opportunity to talk with these farmers. And it was probably one of the hottest days of our visit, and we were in these large saris wrapped with all this fabric, and it was 110 degrees, and we were in this hut talking with these farmers, who were all men, by the way. We were only allowed to talk to the men, so we were the only women in this room filled with these Sikh farmers, who were kind of formal with us, these American researchers. And we were asking them about their experiences as farmers, and we were chatting with them, trying to get them to open up to us. And somehow in this conversation about what they were growing and what their struggles were and what they were facing as farmers in India, somehow I happened to mention that I was a graduate student, which I was at the time, and that as a graduate student I had attended the World Trade Organization demonstrations in Seattle the year before, in 1999, when there was really the first public outpouring of civil society organizations, everyday folks, labor unions, environmental groups to protest this trade policy that was really going to benefit corporations and really hurt farmers around the world. I mentioned that I had been at this demonstration, and this change came over these farmers, and they totally changed their attitude toward us. And one of them looked at me and said, you know, when we saw the news from Seattle and we saw that footage of people in your country marching in the streets, that was the first time we had any idea that the population in the United States might care about farmers half a world away. And I thought, I never knew when I was getting tear gassed in Seattle that there was some Sikh Punjabi farmers that were going to, be so inspired by that action. And again, it was one of those moments of thinking about what incredible power, what incredible possibility there is in the activism and the advocacy and the engagement that we do around food and trade policy here in the United States that has these global ripples. So let me breeze through some of the impacts of these policies and these corporate practices, largely driven by US food companies. I shouldn't say all. In fact, I was just looking at the top 20 food industry companies, so food retailers, processors, agribusiness, pesticide companies. Of the top 20, 10 of the top 20 are housed in one country, which is the United States. Not all 20, but let's say half, 50%, right? So it's a big deal here in this country. So what are we seeing? We're seeing incredible impacts of our global food system on the climate. My most recent book was about this connection. The global food system as a whole is responsible for 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions, which is significantly more, I should note, than all transportation combined. Every single train, plane, and automobile does not stack up to the impacts of the global food system on climate. Largely because it's the food system that is the single largest land user in the United States. And when you think about what's driving rainforest destruction, it's largely agribusiness. In Brazil, it's soy and corn commodity production operations, largely exported then to China for factory farming. In Indonesia, it's commodities like palm oil being grown, but it's rainforest destruction driven by our global food system. This slide shows you data from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations that did this amazing study where they estimated the greenhouse gas emissions associated just with the food that gets wasted, Not even eaten, not even eaten. So all of that food that gets wasted, if you just look at the food lost and waste and the emissions associated with it, it would put food waste third against the United States and China in terms of biggest source of emissions. Which, every time I look at that slide, I'm like, it almost does not compute. It almost boggles the mind that much. So, and it's not just the food and climate connection about how the global food system is impacting the environment. Agriculture in this country, as you all probably know, a major polluter of air and water. I was just in Des Moines, Iowa, which you might be aware of this, but the water in the city of Des Moines is so polluted from agricultural runoff that city residents cannot drink that water until it has gone through a nitrate processing system that's been running for 150 days straight, the longest in Iowa history, because of agricultural pollution. Then there's that little impact that has to do with our health, which is the Centers for Disease Control just released a new study on diet-related illnesses that found that 1 in 2 adults in the United States now has one or more chronic health conditions because of their diet. We know that globally that is the case as well. So 7 of 10 global risks for death are diet-related. This is from a new Lancet study from 2015 that looked at 188 countries and the leading risks for death in every single one of them. And that little blue bar down at the bottom says alcohol use. So if you want to combine, you could say 8 of 10 if you want to consider alcohol use part of our diet. But that's staggering. And one of the things that the researchers that produced this Lancet study said is that the speed at which this global food system has had this incredible impact on our health it's been so fast that the World Health Organization and our global bodies dealing with health has not kept up. So when you look at where the research dollars going, where the public health campaigns going in the World Health Organization, they're going to things like malaria, which obviously malaria is a major, major issue that we should be tackling, but more people are now impacted by diet-related illnesses than some of those diseases that we have seen as kind of the thing we all need to be gathered around and focused on. The other key thing to remember about all of these impacts, every single one of them, from the environment to the health to every single impact about our global food system, it is not happening equally across populations. So the inequity of these impacts needs to be brought to the forefront. Here, the slide is talking about a study from UC Berkeley Labor Center that found that 52% of all fast food workers have to rely on government assistance for food, for healthcare, for housing. There was a study by my colleagues at the Food Chain Workers Alliance that found that food workers, the 20 million food workers in this country, rely on food stamps at twice the rate as an average American worker. So the irony of that, the people who are providing us food are this impacted by food insecurity. Think about the 5.1 billion pounds of pesticides being used on farmland in this country. The toxic impacts of that aren't being felt equally by us. Who's bearing the worst brunt of that? Of course, it's farm workers. And you think about disparities in health outcomes based on race. So this new Robert Wood Johnson Foundation study found that Latinos and African Americans experience 30 to 40% poorer health outcomes than white Americans. 30 to 40%. So how is this all happening? And my mom started talking about her own attempt over decades to really understand what's driving this. And she was talking about, at the end, she was talking about this incredible concentration in wealth and talking about, Ronald Reagan had this idea of the magic of the market, and there's this free market out there. And it's just, us consumers interacting in this totally free market. Well, what do we know about the food system? We know it's not a free market. It doesn't operate like one. And in fact, and I want you guys to try to guess who said this. This is one of my favorite quotes. He said, the quote is, "There isn't a single grain of anything in the world sold in the free market, not one. The only place you see a free market is in the speeches of politicians." So who do you think said that? Anybody want to take a guess? I can tell you it's not my mother. I'll give you that hint. Anybody want to guess? Bernie. Good guess. Good guess.
Good guess.
We should suggest that his speechwriters put this into the next speech. It wasn't Bernie. It wasn't Bernie. Anybody else want to take a guess? Robert Wright, another good guess? No, the person who said this is this man, Dwayne Andreas, the CEO of Archer's Daniels Midland, one of the biggest global agribusiness companies in the world. This quote, said by a man who should know what he's talking about. He was actually, his company, as some of you might know if you've read some of the books like The Rats and the Grain or seen the Matt Damon movie, The Informant, Archer's Daniels Midland was sued for price fixing. I mean, not only did they sort of somewhat know there wasn't a free market out there, they actually were actively engaged in distorting markets in illegal ways. So yes, I love his dog in this picture. So Dwayne Andreas. So what are we seeing? What's the proof of what Andreas certainly knows from his position or his past position at Archer Daniels Midland? What we know is there's incredible consolidation happening in the marketplace for food. It is not a free market. So if you're in an economics class, you know this, but any economist will tell you, if you have more than 4 companies, or less than 4 companies or less, controlling 40% or more of a marketplace, you don't have a free market. It doesn't work the way we're taught by our economics classes as a free market. So what do we see in the food industry is across the industry, from meat to seeds to pesticides, we see this consolidation. So this slide is looking at the cattle industry, hogs and broilers. 82% of cattle slaughter was controlled by just 4 companies, not a free market. In 2011. Hog slaughter in 2011, 63%. Broilers in 2011, 53%. Retailers, similarly, there's just a handful now. It's Walmart, about 1 out of every 4 food dollars we spend is now spent at Walmart. This slide gives you another visual on it. This is about seed consolidation. So looking at large pesticide companies mainly buying seed companies, and this shows you Monsanto, DuPont, Syngenta, Dow. This is from Phil Howard at Michigan State University, who's done amazing work on tracking consolidation in food. So this was a slide I wanted to show you, and then just minutes ago, I got an email from a colleague who works on industry consolidation who said, hey, Anna, did you see that Monsanto is in conversations to merge with Bayer, the chemical company Bayer? So now, if that does pass, DuPont has merged with Dow, Syngenta has merged with ChemChina. If Monsanto merges with Bayer, that would make the 3 largest pesticide companies controlling 65% of the marketplace, and those same companies controlling 61% of the marketplace for seeds. So Dwayne Andreas was certainly right. And all the impacts that we're seeing has to do with how consolidated and controlled the marketplace is. Okay, Mom, you're up.
Thanks. Thank you, Anna. I love that quote, that free market quote. So the last point on this impact that looks so bad is back to where I began, to hungry people in the world. What has so radically changed? I just finished another book on world hunger last fall, and the stunning realization was that as Anna describes, as nutrition is more and more separated from calories, as our food industry produces more and more foods that make us unhealthy, that don't provide us the nutrients we need, there is this divergence, a parting of ways of calories and nutrition. So that although the UN continues to measure hunger in terms of calorie deficiency, and you see that over here, 800, I mean, that's a lot of people right there, but it turns out 800 million doesn't begin to describe the problem anymore. Because if you look at nutrient lack, what we call nutritional deprivation now in our new book, we see that 1/4 of the world's children are stunted. And that doesn't just mean being short. That is a lifelong condition that involves cognitive impairment often and ill health often. So that's 1/4 of the world's children. 2 billion people are deficient in at least one nutrient. And that's no minor thing, because deficiency in one nutrient, say take iron, deficiency in iron alone is associated with 1/5 of all maternal deaths. So this picture that I started out, trusting the UN FAO to tell us something, it is still staying in a frame that doesn't really capture what is the true situation of the world in this highly concentrated industry where nutrition is not the goal. So now I want to shift gears here, though, because I want to take us to the challenge of letting go of this dysfunctional worldview of the scarcity mind, of lack of everything, including lack of goodness in us. And it turns out, of course, that scarcity mind is not based in science. And what is emerging is an ecological worldview that is based in the sciences. It's based in all sorts of learning about human behavior and the natural sciences. And so I think that it is time to recognize what the neuroscientists are telling us, that we humans could actually remake these pathways in our brains. Sometimes it takes a big jolt, though. It takes a moment of dissonance, they like to call it, but you gotta be really rattled. And I think when Anna presents this to us, I get really rattled. This is not working, right? This shows it's not working. So we have a chance to break free, to reprogram. And so what I'm suggesting then is that we can move pretty quickly, I believe, toward a more ecological worldview that is based in science. We can replace what I call the 3 S's over here with the reality that all life is connected, change is the only constant in the natural world, and therefore we are all part of a co-creation moment to moment. It is a very different way of seeing things. I love to quote the late physicist, a friend of mine, Hans-Peter Dürer, a German, who said, "Frankie, in biological systems, there are no parts. There are only participants." And I love that. And Dennis Noble at Oxford, he's a physiologist who, a beautiful little book called The Music of Life, and he writes that in biological systems, there are no privileged components telling the rest what to do. Rather, there's one element shaping all other elements moment to moment to moment. We are all co-creating our reality. It's a very different way of seeing. And there are 2 points I want to make then about as we move from this failed, non-scientific, non-evidence-based view of the scarcity mind to the ecological worldview. And the first point I want to make is that we have to go back to what we assume about our own nature, right? Are we simply really, when you peel away the fluff, are we selfish little shoppers? Actually, more and more evidence is showing, and if we look around in our families and our granddaughters, we see that there are indeed at least six pro-social qualities that human beings have because we evolved in tightly knit tribes. Throughout most of our social evolution, they were fairly egalitarian tribes in which we depended on one another. I could go on and on about this, but we are very unusually social compared to other primates. And so I can't do in the time we have to go over each of them, but I want to say on the second, our capacity for cooperation. All of these things, all these capacities that we have to build with in this more evidence-based worldview that can take us to solutions. They've looked at us in the MRI scans, and for example, they looked at us when we were competing and we were cooperating. They looked at what happened in our brain, and they found out that cooperation is so pleasurable for human beings that it shows up as if we were eating chocolate, similar stimulation to those pleasure centers. So my argument is that we have those capacities if, and this is the key question. What the ecological worldview tells us is whether you're a squirrel or a pansy, whatever plant or animal you are very much shaped by your context, whether what you need to thrive is there for you. And this species, ours, is no different. What are the conditions that allow us to meet both our physical needs and our deepest emotional needs, which I'll claim are our need for connection with one another, our need for a sense of agency? The philosopher Erich Fromm said, it's not I think, therefore I am, it's I affect, therefore I am. The need to make a dent in the world and our need for meaning in our lives. So what are the conditions that allow us to express those needs and to bring out those 6 positive qualities? And it's pretty obvious to me that they are, in fact, the opposite of the conditions that bring out the worst in us. They are the continuous dispersion of power, they are an economic system that keeps wealth circulating because we step up as citizens to put the values, boundaries around the market so that we could all have a really free market, which for me means free to participate in the market. We set the rules through our citizenship to do that. Transparency in human relationships. One of my favorite studies they've done, it was maybe started out as a joke by a psychology professor, but he was really annoyed that the professors at his university weren't paying for their coffee at their honor system coffee station. And so what he did is he snipped a photograph of human eyes that appeared to be looking down at the coffee station, and there's enormous change in the behavior of the professors. Just the idea that somebody might be watching you. You know, we do a lot better when we know that we might be held accountable. That's the social part of our social nature. And then back to mutual accountability. If we're all connected in continuous change and all co-creation, then even those bankers on Wall Street, we can't just blame them. Yes, I believe they should have gone to jail, but where were we when Bill Clinton pulled back the rules and enabled that kind of merger to happen that led to the financial meltdown? You know, where were we? We weren't doing our job as citizens. So mutual accountability means we don't engage in the blame game. We assign responsibility, including to ourselves, so the fingers go all the way around, not just out there. So when that is possible, when we start, what makes that, if we start with the assumption that human beings have these capacities, we have a deep need for fairness and we enjoy cooperation, then we start to believe in democracy. We really can do this because we believe that we can get money out and our voices in and it will work. As that happens, and there are many examples of that even in this country, but throughout the world there are people removing the grip of private wealth. And so the rules are transparent and democratically set. And so wealth begins to be more widely distributed and markets are more competitive and life-serving. And then guess what? It's a virtuous circle because then the experience of scarcity is reduced. We gain confidence ourselves as decision makers. We gain trust in our neighbor, which, by the way, if you look at the sad polls today, is going down, down, down. And so instead of that negative spiral taking us down, down, down into fear, we have this empowerment possibility. And we can shift then into this very, very different frame from this notion of, we've hit the limits of a finite earth. We can take a deep breath and realize that actually through ecological agriculture, lining our energy with the sun's capacities, etc., that there's more than enough for all of us. And we can let go of fear. And this is then makes possible us to realize the abundance that is all around us, and it makes possible what we're going to be now talking about, which is expressed this way.
So as my mom was talking, I was thinking about, as we talk about this food movement rising here and around the world, we think about it happening in a number of ways, and one of the ways is through the transforming the farm, and not in the sense of well, yes, partly that farmers are really taking and embracing these agroecological principles more on the farm, but also fundamentally transforming the relationship between farmer and all of us. And really, as my mom was talking about in that slide around the spiral of empowerment, of what happens when we start not thinking of these markets as something other, but as us as being part of them. And what happens when we start thinking about that kind of mutual accountability? And what happens when we start embracing some of those ideas in that spiral of empowerment, as she puts it? And one of the things that happens in food is you start realizing that you and me as a shopper, we are not in a fight with the farmer or with the person who's providing us our food. We are in a partnership with them. And I think my favorite story of that really expresses this change of thinking and that transforming the relationship between us and the farm is a story from a food cooperative in Seoul, South Korea, of all places, that I met with. And at the time, I was a member of a 19,000 person food cooperative, which I thought was kind of big. I showed up in Seoul, South Korea, only to find out the person I was interviewing was part of a 200,000 person food cooperative. But one of the things that they told me is that every year the consumer members and the farmer members send representatives to an annual meeting at which a lot of things are decided, including the price that's going to be charged for all those 200,000 people. And this cooperative representative said, and Anna, it's the funniest thing, because every year, without fail, we all get into a big fight. And he's sort of smiling, and I was like, well, what do you mean by a big fight? And he said, well, you see, the farmers are fighting with the consumers over the price of rice, which is, as you can imagine, the most widely purchased product in this co-op. And they're fighting with the consumers because they want to charge less, because they want to make sure that their members are thriving as families and have enough money in their pockets and have the resources they need. And our consumer member representatives are fighting with the farmers to pay them more, because they want to make sure that the farmers are doing well and they have the resources they need and they're getting the support that they want. And I was listening to that story and I was like, that is just a whole different way to think about it. And this whole artificial division across the food chain between us and them, between the workers and the consumers. I mean, what does that word even mean? We're not consumers, right? We're all part of this system. And what's been so encouraging for me to see is that we're seeing this kind of mind shift. My mom talked about this idea of kind of shifting our mental maps. We're seeing this happening in food across the world and across this country. And I think one of the kind of indicators of this is just the growth of farmers markets. I mean, are we going to get all of our food from farmers markets? No. But what do farmers markets do? They are part of breaking that artificial disconnect between us on the one hand and food producers on the other. So this slide starts in 2000, which is when the USDA first started tracking in an official way the numbers of farmers markets. That number down there is a little bit more than 1,500. Some of you may know, in the last census, we got to over 8,200 farmers markets. So each of those markets, each of those 8,200 markets, to me, is a representation of that kind of shifting in those connections. We're also seeing this kind of shifting and thinking about a relationship to food and farming through starting to see kind of some normalization of this embrace of farmers and small-scale farmers and local food coming into the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which in 2009 launched a program, an initiative, across every single division in the entire department called Know Your Farmer, Know Your Food. And you can now go to Know Your Farmer, Know Your Food Compass, which I did before coming here, and you can find all the stuff that's happening in your state. There are 89 things listed, and there are probably many more that are not on that compass listed, many, many more. But it's this idea that even at the federal level, there's a sense of really bringing in the story of what's happening on the ground with farming. One of the other things that I found so encouraging is this new movement of young people moving on to the farm, and groups like the National Young Farmers Coalition doing some really cool policy work. Like their latest campaign has been to get farming declared a public service. Because can you imagine if you're a young person and you want to go into farming, what student debt would do to dissuade you from doing it? So this idea that you have these young farmers that are getting activated, that are seeing their role as trying to shift and shape policy. You're also seeing this in the growth of the farm-to-school movement. So this slide starts in 1996, and it goes down to the number 0, because there are effectively no officially on-the-map farm-to-school programs in any public school in the United States. I mean, there were ad hoc ones, but nothing that was really being chronicled in any big way. By the time I got these numbers down in 2014, more than 40,000 schools had a relationship directly with farmers bringing in fresh food into those schools. You're starting to see the growth of programs that are then making those connections happen with young people, like Food Corps. How many people have heard of Food Corps? Oh, good. So a lot of you. So this is a new AmeriCorps program funded by the federal government and private foundations that's getting young people with AmeriCorps programs onto school gardens in communities that need it most, getting kids learning about how to grow their own food, getting them eating that food that they grow. It's that kind of transformation of this idea that farming isn't something that happens out there. It's something every single one of us can be a part of in every single community, no matter your zip code. The other thing that we're seeing happening, which I find really encouraging, is this real sense of how do we move these markets? How do we create some of that competitiveness? How do we get more people embracing the kind of food that we know is good for our bodies? So this woman here is involved with a national network that I know some of you are connected to called Real Food Challenge. The idea was started by a bunch of young people who looked at school food purchasing at universities and colleges in this country. And they recognize that that's a $7 billion market. And what would it look like to get more colleges and universities to turn to local farmers, to turn to sustainable food, to embrace what they call real food? What would it look like to move more dollars in that direction? As one of the young people who got involved with it early on, a man named Josh Viertel, who worked at a sustainable food project at his university, put it, he said, you know, part of the reason why I got so excited about this is because college students shouldn't be reading The Jungle in English 101 and then eating it for lunch. And so you're now seeing hundreds of campuses that are actively working with Real Food Challenge, and I just got their latest figures that they've estimated they've gotten about $76 million moved into the direction of real food. They've got 76 schools that are officially Real Food Challenge members, 135 schools that are in the pipeline, and thousands of students who are engaged. The other thing that we're seeing, of course, is just this incredible growth in the desire for organic food, for food grown without pesticides, grown without artificial hormones, grown without antibiotics. And so this slide goes to 2013, where organic food sales have topped $30 billion. Now, that sounds like a lot. It is. It's still a tiny fraction of what we buy, but in certain shares, certain types of food products, actually, organic has become quite a large share. 12% of fruits and vegetables, 7% of dairy, 23% of carrots, 50% of kale. Who knew kale was the shining star? So there's this sense that there's this movement that's happening really fast, and despite enormous barriers against it, despite enormous funding against it, despite enormous marketing by the food industry, by the pharmaceutical companies, by the chemical companies to try to tell consumers organic doesn't make a difference, organic isn't better for you, you're still seeing this growth. You're also seeing, and this is, I think, just as important as everything else that we're doing and talking about, is you're seeing the story starting to change about food, the kinds of things that my mom was talking about, the story about our relationship to food changing. One of the most encouraging polls I've seen was done by some colleagues of mine at a bipartisan polling firm last year. And about 10 years ago, this firm had done some research looking at consumer attitudes about food. And what they found, and it might not surprise you, is that the folks that they were interviewing in the United States, when you ask them about food systems, their eyes just went blank. You talk about where does food come from, aisle 8 in the grocery store. Their eyes would go blank when you talk about systems. Flash forward to last year, and you could have a poll done, bipartisan poll of a real good sampling of this country, and you could have one of the results be that 94% of those surveyed said it was very or somewhat important our food system promote equal access to healthy food. I mean, talk about a changed story about what we believe is important and what we think needs to change. One of the other things that I found so encouraging, this project I've been working on now for 3 years to run an international short films competition. We started it, this is our 3rd year, so it started a couple years ago. And we started it to solicit and catalyze short films about food and farming and sustainability and food justice. All the films are under 4 minutes long. When I started this contest, I had some cynical friends who said, Anna, all you're gonna get is like a 4-minute ode to somebody's artisanal mayonnaise making operation in Brooklyn. It's not going to tell the story you want to tell. And while I don't think we got any odes to artisanal mayonnaise making, I will say I do know there is a store in the heart of hipster Brooklyn that is only devoted to selling mayonnaise. But I am happy to report that we've gotten hundreds of submissions of films, and they're from everything about food activists in Salt Lake City fighting hunger in that town. They're from public health experts in Holyoke, Massachusetts, describing really, really cool programs they're doing to get kids to kick. So incredibly inspiring stories from all across the country. We're seeing a change in the story from getting new media outlets. Civil Eats is one that I rely on. So new media outlets to help us hear a different story about food, not one that's influenced by corporate dollars. And all of this, I would argue, is really changing the story of food. So I've got one more quote for you to guess who said this. Part of the story that is changing is that people are realizing, that it is possible to embrace the kinds of, the food that we're all talking about and not face that scarcity scare. And this quote says, "Many people will tell you organic food is just for rich people, that it's not an economical way to approach agriculture, that it can't feed the world." Well, guess what? None of that's true. Again, it wasn't my mother, but she might have said this. Yes. Okay, and it wasn't Bernie. Any other guesses? Who said this? And if you get this right, you will get so many points. What's that? Vandana Shiva, good guess. Not her. Okay, no other. I'm giving you a hint that it's like not who you would expect. The same guy. Okay, good guess. That would be cool if you said it. Everybody for the big reveal. Anybody know this guy? Jim Cramer, CNBC Mad Money, said this on a segment about why one should invest in organic food, how this is really growing as a market. So if Jim Cramer is sounding like my mother, then things have really, really taken a turn.
Thank you. That was fabulous. Okay. So I'm going to pick up from there and tell you a few stories before we close of food movement rising in the Global South. Some areas that you would least expect, given other things we've said, and that are most inspiring to me. I like to think of these as village level, in some cases, of what I call living democracy, as a practice that really trusts that we can deliberate together and make good decisions in common. So I want to take you first to southern India, an area that was considered the pesticide capital of the world. I want to introduce you to a group of women who I had the pleasure of meeting a couple of years ago and was able to talk to them about what their life had been like before they found their power together. Because these women have gone from absolute near starvation on a daily basis, what they call dark, dark times of humiliation, being physically beaten by their husbands often, and humiliated by their landlords, having no power they felt over their lives. And then they came together and over a couple of decades have achieved absolute food security. I just want to tell you a little bit more about who they are. They are the lowest caste women in India, the Dalit women. But at some point, they said if we could start meeting every week at 9 o'clock at night, they gather in their group and they started coming together and planning together how they could reverse the degradation of the land, how they could take land that had been fallow because nobody knew what to do with it, and turn it into biodiverse farming. They had been dependent on white rice, government subsidized white rice, so their health was failing because white rice is so lacking in nutrition. They started studying what were the traditional crops, the variety of crops, and by the time I visited them, I walked through their fields of 20 crops with lentils and oilseeds and greens all in one acre. And I said, "Are you concerned about climate change?" They said, "No, we know what to do. We know our seeds." And you see the elder there is inspecting the seeds because these are seed savers. And the women here, their hands outstretched, that is a ritual that they created themselves for all those who will commit to these 3 pledges: no GMOs, no chemicals, and share what we know. Share what we know. And now, every February, they go now to at least 75 villages in a beautiful caravan with dancing and music, and they teach seed saving and sharing to others. They petitioned the Indian government for 7 years, and they got their own radio station. And now they share what they're learning through the radio station. And just since I was there a couple of years ago, they found their voice in local government. And they said, wait a minute, why is the government just subsidizing white rice that makes us sick because it's so lacking? Why not support the women who are growing the millets? These in terms of iron, which is a huge problem for women in India, millet has much more of it. And so now they convince the local government to procure these healthier millets for the school lunches and for the subsidized distribution system. So these women are, you can see how inspired I am. And as I left them that day, I have to say, as we're sitting around on the mat at these beautiful seats, guess who served us tea? It was a young man. So something is really changing in these villages. Now, you may say, well, that's great, 75 villages, that doesn't amount for much, it's a big country. But actually, now, in 2 states in southern India, of which they're in 1, that there are now, I've got to check my numbers here, that there are 8,000 villages. 15% of the arable land is now moving toward ecological agriculture. And the state government is actually giving stipends to what they call village activists to teach about ecological agriculture to their neighbors. So as I left the village, they grabbed my arm and stopped me, and they said, what we want to leave you with is what we most gained from working together. What we most gained is courage. That's what they wanted me to tell folks at home. Now I want to jump to another part of the world. I want to take you to Niger. And I just had to check out this story because it's so good. Sometimes I get nervous. It's too good to be true. Let me just really briefly take you to Niger. Now it turns out this is a picture of what is called agroforestry. If many of you have heard of the actual planting of crops and trees in the same fields. And in this part of the world, this is a huge benefit. In some cases, you can double the yields by mixing trees, certainly the trees that fix nitrogen in the soil, but they also keep the soil cooler. They hold it down against the winds in this part of the world, the Sahara Desert moving south. They hold the soil. They've actually improved the water table by nurturing these trees. These were trees that there were small roots, but they thought they were not good for agriculture, so they'd cut them. But it turns out they nurtured them, and agriculture gained. And now, I don't know if you can read this, but I put this all out here because this approach is now half of the farmland in Niger. And agroforestry, it turns out, of all the different mitigation things we can do in farming to store more carbon, many who look at this say that agroforestry is the highest return in terms of sequestering carbon of all the different things that we can do. So I just wanted to show you how enormous this breakthrough is. Almost 3 million people have gained food security. Oh, I didn't bring in the living democracy piece of this. To enable this to happen, the farmers had to work together because they had to allow the trees to grow. So they had to cooperate, and they had to mark the limb that was going to grow up into the tree and trust each other not to cut it because everybody's desperate for firewood. So they had to come together and trust each other to allow the trees to grow. And some of these, also I should add, that grow fruit in which you can add to your income significantly. Finally, I want to take you to a country nearer. I want to take you to Brazil. Now, I know Brazil is going through a terribly rough time right now, but we can't in any way let that erase the enormous accomplishments in this country that have made a huge difference to people. Through a citizens movement, through the 1980s and 90s, what grew was the capacity to elect a working person as the president of the country who declared the goal, because of a lot of citizen movements that pressed for it, the goal of zero hunger, fome zero. And the approach, when Anna and I got there in the year 2000, got to Brazil, we learned that the approach was very much this participation of every sector of society. We got to go to the third largest city in Brazil, Belo Horizonte, that had approached the goal of zero hunger by putting together a council that represented all parts of society, from universities to business people to churches and all youth, you name it. Everybody was represented in this council, and they came up with the most creative ideas. I don't have time to go through many of them, but I'll just mention one very simple thing. They call it straight from the countryside. Of course, that's the translation, but the city just said, okay, there are these, plots of land, little spots of urban turf, and we will let you, the organic local farmer, use it if you will keep your prices in the reach of poor people. And they said, sure, because they got such a great, number of customers. So it was a win-win. And they had literally dozens and dozens of innovations, right? I mean, simple things like in the bus stops, you could read where you could buy the 45 basic commodities at the lowest price. So the price gouging was undercut. It's keeping the market fair. And so so much I'd love to tell you, but I just want to give you this punchline. That over a 20-year period, Brazil cut the number of hungry people by 40%. The city that Anna and I visited, and that picture was taken, this has to be the speed of light in social change, that in 12 years cut child mortality by 73%. And when Anna and I sat with Adriana Ranha, the woman who was in charge of coordinating all these initiatives, these participatory initiatives, we said, Adriana, do you know how out of step you are? Because we're told that the market can solve everything. And you're saying, no, that people can engage and come up with these innovations. Do you know how out of step you are? And she went on and on in Portuguese, and we couldn't understand a word. And we finally interrupted the interpreter. And what is she saying? And Adriana said, yes, I knew how out of step we were. But what makes me so upset, and she was tearing up, what makes me so upset is it's so easy to end it. It's so easy to end it, that's why I'm crying. And what we took from that is not that it's easy in the simple sense, but it's doable. We can do it if we just use this very different premise that we have the capacity to, as citizens, to come together and to make the market serve us. So that's really what I'm suggesting is what I mean by living democracy. And it is what we do, not just something we have. So I want to close tonight with just a very simple, very personal statement. That asking, this is what I ask myself all the time. Okay, you're telling yourself and others that we're in this extraordinary moment where we can shift from a failing frame to one that is actually aligned with the best in us and with nature. So what do we need? What do we need in ourselves right now? And what I call it, this is just my personal label for it, I call it bold humility. And I want to talk about the bold part just for a second. What I'm saying is that we humans are so social. It's got this double edge. We're accused of being too individualistic, but actually we're so dependent on the approval of others that one of the hardest things, we want to fit in. So one of the hardest things about our social nature is that when we're in the wrong track, when we're heading over the falls, we've got to break with the pack. But it's very scary because we're so tightly knit. And so we need a new understanding of fear. We've got to see fear as a source of energy. And I'm not the most courageous person in the world, so I'm having to do these reframes. And a couple years ago, I was in a situation where I knew that if I spoke up, I would be out of step with all of my friends, and my heart was going like this, like this, like this. And I said, okay, Frankie, you usually just say to yourself, you wimp. Why don't you reframe that? And so from that moment on, every time my heart goes like that, I say, oh, it's your inner applause. It's your inner applause telling you you are right at that edge. And so I think that this idea that this is the time when we've got to see that fear doesn't mean we're in the wrong place. It might mean we're in exactly the right place. And we can learn from our social nature that if we want to become more courageous, we associate with courage. And that's why I like to associate with my daughter. We associate with courage. And we know that, so find people who are more gutsy than you and hang out with them. That's how we change ourselves. And I know there are a lot of gutsy people in this community because I met a bunch of them already. So I just wanted to say that. And then the humility part of bold humility. The humility part is simple, is that when Anna and I share stories with you that have so inspired us, we realize, I think I can speak for both of us, that if somebody had asked us, 20 years ago, is that possible? When I described to you what happened in Bello, for example, or those women in southern India, if I'd said they would go from this to that in 20, I would have said, I don't think I'd really bet on it. And so the humility part, I realize, is that if the world is really this ecological, the three the three C's, that we're all connected, change is ever happening, and we're all co-creating, then truly it is not possible to know what's possible. It's not possible to know what's possible. That's why I call myself not an optimist, pessimist, but a possibilist. And if it's not possible to know what's possible, that is so freeing, right? Because we can just go for the world we want. And it helps me. And the other thing that helps me are some words that Anna and I have been touched by over the years of a very courageous poet named Denise Lebertoff. And it's on the theme of hope, and I'd like to end with this poem. Because hope is powerful. Hope is actually something that can help us meet our goals. So it's called Beginners. We have only begun to love the earth. We have only begun to imagine the fullness of life. How can we tire of hope? So much is in bud. How can desire fail? We have only begun to imagine justice and mercy. We have only begun to envision how it might be to live as sibling with beast and flower, no longer as oppressor. We've only begun to know the power that is ours if we would join our solitudes in a communion of struggle. So much is unfolding that must complete its gesture. So much is in bud. Thank you. You are wonderful. Thank you. I thought the greatest joy in life a parent could ever imagine was traveling the world with Anna on our journey, and then to see her and to learn from her constantly is just a continuous source of tremendous joy, as you can imagine. So we don't get to do this often. It's very special. Together, often, so thank you. So.
Wow, that was fantastic. We have, I think, about 10, 15 minutes for questions. I'll relinquish this mic, and there's one over there, so if you could line up. But before we turn it over to questions, I just want to take a moment to make a quick plug for my good friend and colleague, Lorraine McCosker, who coordinates the Common Experience Project on Sustainability film series. And coincidentally, the film coming up on March 30th is Seeds of Time. So we hope to see a lot of you there. Thank you all for coming. So, got a question?
I feel silly asking you a question since we hung out almost.
Yeah, you're like an old friend here. Yeah.
I'm Mary from Community Food Initiatives, and I was curious to hear from you more about the development of power and efficacy, particularly within the framework at the local level. I really appreciate your talk because I think one of the things that has excited me the most within this work is really identifying that the dominant paradigm is weakest at the local level. And so there's so much that we can do right here in our own communities and in our own region. But I think that initial step in experiencing our own power and efficacy is really critical. And so can you speak to that a little bit more, particularly in terms of local policies, whether that's within the framework of government or just within the community in which we live? Thank you.
Yeah, no, and it kind of goes to, we were talking about this a little bit earlier today. What comes to mind is, thinking about a lot of the current work that my mom is doing, which she touched on a little bit today, but give her a chance, she'll touch on it a lot, but is about money and politics and how I think increasingly how hard it is to see ourselves reflected in our elected leaders, so-called leaders. I mean, that poll, that bipartisan poll that said that 94% of voters, that wasn't just of one particular political persuasion, that was of voters surveyed, felt like everyone should have access to healthy food. And yet, look at what our government policies are doing, absolutely blocking that. And so I do feel like what we're starting to see is this frustration with, because there's such an influence of money in politics at the highest level, how can we circumvent that? And one of the ways is at the local level, at the state level. I was telling you about my experience. Recently I live in the city of Berkeley. It's about 100,000 people. And we decided a couple years ago, a coalition of groups decided to propose a 1 cent per fluid ounce beverage tax on sugar-sweetened beverages. And the soda industry spent $2.5 million in the city of 100,000 people to try to stop that from happening. And it was one of these moments where you saw, well, because the groundwork had been laid, where this really strong coalition had been built, where people really trusted each other, and it came from a real decision that we want to work on healthy communities in Berkeley. Diabetes is an epidemic, particularly in the African American community, and the NAACP said, they were the ones who were like, let's get the sugar-sweetened beverage tax on the ballot and move it forward. So despite all that spending, we won 74.1% yes. And being at that election night party was probably the happiest place to be that particular election season, but it was so thrilling to see who came together. And so I feel like that's the story that gives me hope, is that when you actually give people a chance to work together for something they believe in, no amount of money. I mean, the soda industry ended up spending $709 for every yes vote they got. But even flooding a town with money still couldn't stop the people from winning. So I think it's a really positive story. And as a postscript, the city of Berkeley now looks like we will be getting, which was predicted, $1.2 million every single year from the sugar-sweetened beverage tax, and we're funneling it directly to nutrition education programs and school garden programs, and directly into the kinds of things we want to support. So just one little story, little example that I think kind of gets at your question. Yeah, so the signs were these bright red signs, and the signs simply said, Berkeley versus Big Soda. But I called them around my house. We knew the organizer, Sarah, who was one of the organizers, so we called them Sarah's signs. But my kids knew to identify them, and it was so amazing. Driving around town, our game we would play during election season was they would count how many Sarah signs they saw. And let me tell you, do you know how many houses had the signs on the other side against the tax? 0. I never saw a single person, a single home against the tax. What you saw were paid canvassers going door to door. What you saw were paid people standing at the public transit stops to tell you to vote against the tax, but you didn't see any residents who were against it. So, yeah.
Can I make a big claim that I think I believe? And, I'm testing it out. But I believe that our greatest, my premise is that at least one of our greatest obstacles is cynicism and despair, that are very closely related, and that the capacity to succeed locally, to find, the energy and the commitment locally can't be separated from the national, because it is so depressing. And if you look up for one moment, it's so depressing, right? So what I'm personally super excited about right now is the canopy of hope being built by a very, very broad-based democracy movement growing in the United States that is planning. I'm going to participate a march that begins in Philadelphia on the 2nd of April to the Capitol. This is all about getting money out of politics and reinstating voter rights protections. And we will sit on the Capitol steps on the 11th of April. Then there will be further actions after that and another civil disobedience the following week. And groups, as there are hundreds, 200 groups at least involved in these, having from the Union of Concerned Scientists to the NAACP to the Sierra Club to Food and Water Watch to unions, several AFL-CIO and others. But so I just want to lay out there that for me, I get more motivated locally if I sense some hope nationally. And so I think the key is, a friend of mine gave me this metaphor. He said, Frankie, you can love more than one child at once. In other words, you can have your passion locally and be acting on it, but part of your love is to plug in as possible to a broader democracy movement that keeps our energy going, that keeps our sense of our long-term capacity to actually take on the things that have to be dealt with, climate change, that have to be dealt with nationally and internationally. So for me, it's that's not anything. It's another way to support the local, is to also be aware of, in any way one can contribute, even if it's talking about it to your neighbors, this kind of, and plug in. It's called Democracy Spring. And the other movement the next week is Democracy Awakening. So all you have to remember are those two things. You can find out all about it. And there are already over 2,000 people who've committed to risk arrest on behalf of democracy. So.
Would you comment on golden rice?
Sure. You want to take it first? What's that?
You can take it.
Golden rice. So how many of you, when you hear golden rice, do you know what that is? So just a little background. So I'm trying to remember, maybe you know if you asked the question, when did that Time magazine cover appear for golden rice? 10 years, 12, 15 years? Actually, it was when we were writing Hope's Edge, so 16 years ago. So golden rice, what is it? It's, in theory, the idea that you could genetically engineer rice so that it produces vitamin A that would reduce vitamin A deficiency if you consume it. And this was, there was a Time magazine article cover about it 16 years ago. This is like one of these promises that we heard about. And I remember at the time that came out, folks like Marion Nestle and Vandana Shiva, many others who were nutrition experts and agricultural experts and health experts were saying, actually the last thing even if this technology were to work, the last thing we need is a solution to vitamin A deficiency, which is a real problem of tinkering with rice. What we need to be doing is promoting biodiverse diets, promoting indigenous foods, getting people to grow their own foods in these places that have vitamin deficiency. In so doing, what do? You do what Wendell Berry, the poet farmer, says, you solve for pattern. Because if you're getting people to grow their own food, they're going to be eating food that has they're not going to have vitamin A deficiency. And at the same time, guess what? They're going to be getting all of those other nutrients they need. And guess what? They're also going to be able to feed themselves next year, no matter what happens to the price of that theoretical golden rice that doesn't really work as it's promised to or existing, you know. But so this idea that there would be this tinkering with something as vital to so many cultural traditions as rice that would theoretically produce this and be able to address this vitamin deficiency totally undermines our sort of philosophy about approaching food as a system and approaching food with respect to the cultural traditions. And so that's my somewhat short answer on golden rice. I would just add because it brings up this question of genetic engineering, GMOs, genetically modified organisms, and genetic engineering in agriculture, that we have heard so many promises about what this technology is going to do for us. We've heard so much of the fear mongering that if we don't accept this, that people will go hungry. And what have we seen commercialized since 1996? It's really simple. It's basically seeds that were created by chemical companies to either replicate and perform like a chemical insecticide or to be resistant to a chemical herbicide. That is 99.9% of the commercialized GMOs in the marketplace. They're a tool to dominate market share for those seed and pesticide companies that I mentioned. It's not, that's not my opinion. That's not me being like an anti-GMO activist. That's the facts. That's just what they are. You read, company Monsanto, that's the major maker of these products. You read their filings with the Security and Exchange Commission. You look at where their profit comes from. Most of it comes from one herbicide. They're a chemical company that gets their chemicals into the marketplace through these engineered seeds. So I want us to be really careful, because your question raises it, to look at what's been commercialized and genetically engineered. It's not anything about nutrition, or it's not to increase yields. It's not to, it's a tool that's been very profitable for a handful of companies, but it's not actually going to systemically address any of the big picture stuff we talked about: health, environment, equity, and in many ways really undermines that. So that's my slightly longer story about GMOs. I think that framing is really important. But other questions? Yeah.
Matt.
Hey everyone, my name's Matt Roberts. I work for Upgrade Athens County, which is kind of the other side of the democracy piece, the energy. And the other day you told me something that stuck. You said we need to get away from this language of talking about nonprofits and move to a social benefit organization or social catalyst organization. Can you talk about the importance of that language change and how we can go about doing that, some practices?
Oh, thank you for that, Matt. Yeah. Well, I really am obsessed with the power of words to confuse us or to enlighten us and empower us. And so I've just been an advocate for many years now of dropping the term nonprofit organization, because it defines us as a negative, where we are, if in that, our organization is that. But it defines it as a negative, and it defines it in terms of money, the two things that we're not really focused. We don't want to be negative, and we're not about money. And so we have chosen to call our organization a social benefit organization, or SBO. And we actually, I noticed, Matt, you used it after I mentioned it. I noticed that. And it's really catching on. So this is one of the many examples. Free market is another one that just absolutely makes my skin crawl, because that the markets today, as we now know from Archer Daniels Million's guy, is totally unfree. So I think it's so important that we be very, very careful about how we, like for the free trade agreements, for example, is just such an obfuscation. And well, I could go on and on about words, but thank you for that opportunity. I'll stop there, hoping there's another question.
Yeah, and as she's coming up, Matt, I also noticed what you were saying. You used the term social benefit a few times. And even though, of course, I've heard my mother say this many times, and I tend to still use nonprofit. And I even noticed hearing you talk about social benefit organizations, it ended up, I was noticing it. It felt different to hear you talk about them called that than called a nonprofit. And so yes, I was reinvigorated to bring this into my personal lexicon, but yes. Yeah. I think it's just not on. That one isn't on, but this one is, yeah.
There's been a lot of impact on the agricultural system by Monsanto and other corporations. How is this 15% able to get around that and not have that oppression by the companies?
Yeah, I don't know the full answer to that, but I know that there's just so much suffering in rural India today. And the women who made those films, I didn't tell you that they also learned how to make films. I told you about the radio, but anyway, you know, you can see on the films that they've made of their condition, they filmed an ad from Monsanto on TV promising the world, and then you see in the same film a woman who's dying she committed suicide because she believed what Monsanto says and had rented some additional land, and then it didn't produce, and she couldn't pay her debts, and she had killed her. She was dying. So I think there is such intense suffering, and I can't say I fully understand it, but I can share with you some of the sources I'm using to follow it. There's a website called tippingpoints.org, I believe, and I've learned a lot through that. Anyway, I think it's the misery of people that just is not working for them. And the state of Kerala, a small state in southern India, declared it is going to be completely organic within 10 years, and it's well on the way to meeting that goal. That came out of a participatory living democracy planning process in that state a number of years ago. So I know many of you know the work of Vandana Shiva. She's another part of India where she has a training program there and has her associates village by village training people, and we met some of them in ecological methods. So I think just on so many levels it's not working. One of the things that blew my mind in the World Hunger Book is we learned that India spends so much on subsidizing, it spends as much on subsidizing fertilizers as a third of their defense budget. I mean, it's enormous. It's just not tenable. And so I think desperation breeds some innovation. And I want to learn more, but I can share with you some of the sources that I find really fascinating. And do you know more how to answer that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was good. I think there's another question. I mean, I would just add, I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens with the current political situation in India, what happens to this really robust, diverse civil society in that country, as there's been such pushback. Some of you who've been following what's been happening there know about this and defunding of social benefit organizations. So we'll see, but I mean, there these examples that my mom was sharing from the Deccan Development Society. I mean, yes, she mentioned it was it's quite a large network, but that's not the only network of its kind. I mean, there's so many examples happening across the huge country that is India, and I think it's again this representation of that there's these movements emerging that are loosely connected to each other, loosely connected to global networks like La Via Campesina, which is a global peasant organization. So they're connected, but they're also really making that change on the ground again, despite enormous barriers and enormous obstacles at the federal level. So yeah, I think there was another.
And even the president, the right-wing president, acknowledges that farmer suicide is a huge crisis in his country, and I mean he doesn't deny that this is related to the failure of the agricultural model.
I think she had a question right next to you, Lauren. Yeah.
Hello. One of the things about your presentation that I was struck by was the amount of women in your case studies and your stories and how empowered they were to pursue that sustainable food system. And I was wondering if you could speak to the special relationship between women and their food as the primary caregivers, and ultimately, we continue on the next generation, and how that nutritional aspect is so important, and also the culturally layered eating disorders of the Western society, and how that relationship with food is kind of broken at this point.
Oh, great question.
Yeah.
Do you want me to start? Or, yeah. Yeah, such a great question. And, I think it was something my mother and I were struck by early on in this collaborative work, where we mentioned we kind of collaborated through this work, through this book, Hope's Edge. And it was only kind of toward the end of this worldwide journey that we had that we realized how many of the leaders we met were women. So Vandana Shiva was one of the people that we met with, Adriana Aranja from Brazil. You heard my mom quote her. Wangari Maathai from the Greenbelt movement in Kenya, who then went on to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And I think we were so struck in hearing their stories, how they really personified the statistics that many of us know, which is that women do bear the brunt of providing the nutrition, providing food for their children, that women are globally the majority of farmers, that women are doing all of this work that's unrepresented in the kind of traditional metrics of how we measure GDP or how we measure economic activity, and that we were seeing so much of that leadership come out from women, made a lot of sense to us. And I think, to your point about how this incredible epidemic, talk about epidemic of eating disorders. I was just listening to a special on eating disorders in the United States, and it was described as the most lethal mental disorder in this country. That deaths actually from eating disorders are not uncommon, and how eating disorders are becoming more common, and how it is such this expression, as you put it, of this rupture around the culture of food. And I think about it a lot in terms of raising two girls. About, to be honest, I personally didn't have an eating disorder, but I knew many. I mean, you can't grow up in this country as a woman, honestly. I don't know what this generation is like. I'm guessing it's worse. But you can. I don't feel like you can grow up in this country as a woman and not be close to somebody who has an eating disorder. So I remember when I had my first daughter, I was thinking, oh my gosh, okay, how do I make sure she doesn't have an eating disorder? And then my second daughter, okay, how do I make sure? And I've sort of so gotten over that fear, because I thought, well, how did I not have an eating disorder? And I realized, maybe it had to do with this woman over here, right? And that from the earliest stage of my life, food was just this real part of our lives. And it was healthy food, and it was sustainable to my body and to the planet, and I wasn't bombarded with media messages about food, and so, not to say, knock on wood, that I'm in the clear with my kids, but I do feel like it goes to show you that when you do bring people and children back in relationship to the culture of good, healthy food, and we're seeing it with programs like the Food Corps and stuff that's happening in your community, we're seeing that disconnect knitted together again, that I think you will, and I'm no expert on eating disorders, but that my sense is that you will see less of that rupture when people have that opportunity to have a right relationship with food. I certainly hope that's true for my kids, and I certainly know that that's one of the biggest impacts of this dominant food system in our country. So.
I just wanted to add about the experience in India of, yes, because the women were traditionally the ones who were expected to feed the family, and literally, when they stepped up and actually took leadership in developing this more nutritious approach to eating, that their status in those villages was raised, so that they told me that now when there's any issue in the village, they bring the issue to the women's sangha. And that their husbands treat them with so much more respect, and whenever there is a battering of a woman in that village, the whole women's group goes and confronts the batterer. So it's really, their stepping up in leadership in food has really changed the gender relationships in their villages. Is what I gathered, and so. It goes,
we saw similar things in Kenya.
It's related to food and goes way beyond food in what I've experienced.
conversation. But in fairness, we should wrap it up and also allow a little bit of time, if it's still possible, for some book signing.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I saw there was a whole Lappé cornucopia of books. And I don't know if they got passed around, but we have sign-up sheets for people to stay in touch with us.
We have a quarterly e-letter and just,
Yeah, and
we don't
it's-
bombard you.
Yeah, it says Real Food Media, which is the project that I work on, but we'll
I'll plan it
yeah,
too, yeah.
we will connect with you as the Lappés. And yeah, and if you want to get other little doses of inspiration, if you go to realfoodfilms.org, you have under 4-minute long films, 60 of them, on all different topics. If you want your daily dose of inspiration, you can go to realfoodfilms.org and see that.
And I just want to add repeat how incredibly inspired I've been by this community. And I don't say that to everybody who I speak to. And I just want you to know I want to come back. So thank you so much. Thank all of you.
Thank you.